Okay, today we're going to go over 7.8. Now, what we're going to look at is the different types of factoring. So we're going to start out from the basic level and work our way up. First thing we need to look at, though, is that a thing called factor by grouping. This is something that we haven't done yet, but you will see the purpose in it as we go through. So the first thing we're going to do is let's just kind of recap what we did at the beginning. At the beginning, we had something like this, 3x squared plus 6x, and I asked you to factor it completely. And to factor it, what you needed to do is say, oh, its greatest common factor that you can pull out of this would be a 3 and an x. So we pulled out or divided out a 3x, which gave us x plus 2. And that was our final answer. So this was a binomial that was being factored. The second thing that we did was factoring for different types of things. So let's say I had a trinomial, x squared minus 5x plus 6. And we did the x factor for this one. So the first thing we did was put a negative 5 at the top because that was our middle. We had no number in front of the x squared, so we just dropped down the last term in the bottom part of our x. Then we asked ourselves what two things multiply and make 6, but then add and make negative 5. Well, most of the time we got the 3 and the 2. That wasn't the issue. It's the signs. So keep an eye on the signs. We know positive 3 times positive 2 is positive 6. But it does not add up to negative 5. But if you make both of them negative, now you have the correct solution. So your answer here is going to be x minus 3 and x minus 2. Now, our journey continues. We went into the difference of squares and perfect squares. So a difference of squares look like this, 49x squared minus 64. And we said, okay, we handle this different. This is not an x factor, but what it is we do the square roots. So the square root of 49 is 7, and then you take half of x, and then you put the 7x in the front of the second one. Now, we know that this is difference of squares, so that means one positive, one negative. And then the last thing we do is the square root of 64, which is 8. And that is our answer for the difference of squares. So let's go down to journey to our next one. The next thing that we did was a perfect. So a perfect basically of squares looks like this. If I have x squared minus 14x plus 49. Now this one can be handled by the x factor, in which kind of that's what we did in class, but then I gave you guys the option of knowing it's a perfect square also. If it's a perfect square, then you look at the end terms. So in this case, you have a 1, which the square root of 1 is 1, and 49, and the square root of 49 is 7. Since it has a plus sign at the end, that tells me that it is one of my perfect candidates. So we cut the x in half. We do the square root of 49, which is 7. And instead of having opposite signs like the last one, you're going to have the same sign. So they're both going to be negative. So when you rewrite this, it is x minus 7 quantity squared. So that right there is an example of one of your perfects. All right, before we got to that, though, we did these lovely trinomials that had numbers in front. So 3x squared minus 5x minus 2. So this one we did two steps. We started off with the x factor, and then we went into the rectangle method to get it out and into the correct answer. So starting with the x factor method, we do is basically was the umbrella, if you remember that we called it that, because you had to do the first times the last, which gives you negative 6 for the bottom, and the middle is still negative 5. So in this case, we say, okay, what two things multiply and make negative 6, but then combine or add and make negative 5? Well, it's negative on the bottom, so that means I have one positive and one negative for my answers. If we take and we look at the different factors, we have 2 and 3, which their difference would be 1. And then we have 6 and 1, which that difference would be 5. So we know it's 6 and 1. But now you have to look at which one would be negative. And in this case, the bigger one needs to be negative, so your 6 will be negative and your 1 will be positive. Okay, now remember with this type, you do not jump directly into the two parentheses. You have to do your factor box. So we put the 3 in the upper left-hand corner because it's the first one, and the -2 in the lower right-hand corner. The two factors you just found, you're going to put up here, so -6 and +1. Now we ask ourselves, what can I factor out of that top row? Well, I can take out a 3. So 3 times what gives me 3? It's a 1. 3, well, divided into -6 is -2. So now I ask myself, 1 times what gives me 1? Well, it has to be 1. And then if we check ourselves, 1 times -2 is -2. So we have all the correct factors. Let's put our x's behind our first top terms. So 3x plus 1. And we have x minus 2. So now we have that one completely factored. Okay, so that is our stroll down memory lane for that. So today, this is the one thing that we haven't covered. We haven't covered factoring by grouping. Now, factoring by grouping is a little tricky, but let's talk about a few things that you have to know. First thing is that you have to have them in descending power order. So step 1, descending power order. So what that means is the biggest exponent comes first, and then the next biggest, and so forth, all the way down until you have no more variables. Now remember, when we talk about descending power order, it is the same variable. So it'd be all x's this or all y's. If you have a mixture of x's and y's, then you're going to have to look at them and make sure that the same ones that have like a's in it are together and the same ones that have b's in it are together. So let's look at some examples that aren't theoretical at this point. So in your note packet, you look on page 242, number 1, we have b cubed minus 4b squared plus b minus 4. So factor by grouping states that you can't look at this and pull something out of all of them, okay? And it's because the last one does not have a b. So what we do here is we go, okay, if we group the first two and we group the second two, we should be able to pull them out individually. So if you look at this, both of them have a b squared in common. So we take out a b squared. So when I have this, this is b squared parenthesis b minus 4. Now, for this one, we can take out just a +1. So +1 parenthesis b minus 4. If the two groupings match, then you are able to continue the factoring. So I would then factor out a b minus 4, the whole thing. So that means my first part of my answer is b minus 4. And the second part is what's left over, which is this 2, which is going to be b squared plus 1. So your answer for this is b minus 4 and then b squared plus 1. All right, let's do another one, and then you should be ready to continue on. So number 2 was that one that I told you that if you didn't have accelerating powers, but it's already set up nicely for you. If you notice, we have C's and D's and A's and B's. And if you notice here, the A's are in front and the B's are in front. So let's just leave them the way they are. And we are going to group stuff out. So in the first one, I can pull out an A. That gives me C plus D. And in the second one, I can pull out a positive B, which gives me C plus D. So my groupings match, so I'm going to pull them out. So C plus D is my first grouping, And remember, the second one is buildup of the other two that were out front, so A plus B. And that is your final answer. All right, let's talk about some negative stuff. So let's look down like at number 5. So let me switch paper here. Okay, so for number 5, we have 8s cubed plus s minus 64s squared minus 8. So this one's not ready to start grouping because if you notice, they're not in descending power order. So let's do our rewrite. So our rewrite should be the biggest one first, which is 8s cubed. Then we're going to put the minus 64s squared, then our plus s, and then our minus 8. So now we are in true descending power order. Now we can go through and factor. So if I take and do it this way, we can pull out an 8s squared. So 8s squared. And when we divide that, I get s minus 8. And over here, it only has a positive 1 in common, so plus 1. So this gives me s minus 8 again. The two groupings match, so s minus 8 is what you're going to factor out, which in the end is s minus 8 and 8s squared plus 1. And that's because I get it from those. All right, and then number 6 here. This one is unique because of the signs. So I have 12a cubed plus 2a squared minus 30a minus 5. So let's factor by grouping. So let's group out the first two and the last two again, because they're already, like I said, in descending power order. So you can take out a 2a squared. And when I do that, I end up getting 6a plus 1. And in this one, here's where it's different. Do you see how the 30 here is negative? If the first term in either grouping is negative, then you need to pull a negative. So this is going to be negative 5. So instead of factoring out a positive number, we're going to factor out a negative number. And when we do that, that's going to change the signs. That's all it's going to do. So instead of having a negative 6, you're going to have a positive 6a. And instead of having a negative 1, you're going to have a positive 1. Now, we factor out the grouping that they both have in common. So this becomes 6a plus 1 and 2a squared minus 5. And now you are finished. Okay, so what I want you to do is stop the video, and I want you to try a couple of these on this front page. So why don't you try number 7 and 8, and then when you turn the video back on, you can continue. And let me write them on here just in case I misplaced your note packet. You still have the ability to do these problems. Okay, so like I said, pause the video and then come back to it when you are ready. Check your answers. Okay, I hope you paused it. Here are the results for 7 and 8. So the first one, as you can see, I pulled out a 4x squared and a negative 5 for the second grouping. I put them down and I got x minus 3 for each one after I took those out. So I divided out an x minus 3, which gave me x minus 3 and 4x squared minus 5 for my answer. Second one, I took out a 3h squared and a negative 5 again. So this gave me 7h plus 6 in my groupings. So I grouped out 7h plus 6, which gave me 7h plus 6 and 3h squared minus 5 for my answer. All right, I hope you're feeling more comfortable. Now the last part is just factor by grouping, moving stuff around. So you may be doing the first half like we were doing. So 9 through 16, basically you are taking 1 through 8 and combining some of that along with the examples that I gave you at the very beginning of this video. So let's go back and let's look at the second part, which is the solving. So number 17 starts us on the path for solving. It is still a trinomial type of thing. It's called factoring completely, which we have already started doing this in our earlier sections. So this really is not a brand new concept. This is just a review thing, but I want to go through and make sure that you see what they are talking about. So in this particular one, you can factor out a 3. So you get x squared minus 7x plus 10. So now you can do the x factor. So there's my negative 7, here's my positive 10. I am looking at probably negative 2 times negative 5, which will give me positive 10, but then give me negative 7 when I add them. So 3 parentheses x minus 2 and x minus 5 equals 0. So when I set each one of these equal to 0, if you recall, we ended up with two answers, x is 2 and x is 5. Now, looking at number 19, because 18 is just like 17, 19 is a little different. This is taking the difference of squares and changing it a tad. So the first thing you need to realize is that we have to pull out or factor out a c squared. So take out a c squared first, and this gives me c squared minus 81. Now that is a difference of squares. So I know if I do the square root of c squared, I'm going to get c. I'll put that in the front of each grouping. And then I have difference, that means one positive, one negative. The square root of 81 is, you're right, 9. So when I do this, we're going to have c squared equals 0. So basically c equals 0. And then c plus 9 equals 0, so c is going to equal negative 9. And then c minus 9 equals 0, so c equals 9. So your answers are going to be negative 9, 0, and 9. All right, so let's look at number 20 and 22. And then that means that'll leave you 18 and 21 to work on. So 20 really is not a difficult concept. It's just a rewrite, and actually says 22. So we'll just do number 20, and then that gives you 3 problems to work out of the 6. So 9d plus 9 equals d cubed plus d squared. So the first thing I want you to recognize here is that our bigger exponents are positive. So that means I'm going to move the 9d and the 9 to the right side by subtraction. So if we do that, this just rewrites as d cubed plus d squared minus 9d minus 9. And if you noticed, I kept them in descending power order because that will make this easier to factor. So let's do our factor by grouping. I can pull out a d squared on the first one, so I rewrite that out front, which gives me d plus 1. And the second one, remember, it's a negative, so therefore I'm pulling a negative 9 out. So when we divide or factor out a negative 9, we're going to get d plus 1. So once again, the d plus 1s are in common. So that means I'm going to pull the d plus 1 out front, and it's going to give me d squared minus 9. Now, normally we would stop here, but if you notice in this answer, do you see that the d squared minus 9 is another difference of squares? Well, if this should happen, that means you have to go one more step. So let's rewrite the d plus 1 down one more time. And this is going to become d, because I do the square root of d in front of both, one positive 3 and one negative 3. Now I'm ready to set these equal to 0. So d plus 1 equals 0, d plus 3 equals 0, and d minus 3 equals 0. So I have d equals negative 1, d equals negative 3, and d equals 3. So if you write this in your least to greatest, it's negative 3, negative 1, and 3. as your answers respectively. Okay, this concludes the video. We have now finished Chapter 7. You will be picking up a study guide to prep for the test, which will be next week. Good luck, and I will see you when I return.